They said a man like Thorn was destined to die exactly as he had lived, silent, frozen, and entirely alone. He was a creature of the high ridges, a man whose face bore the jagged road map of a life spent battling the unforgiving elements of the American frontier. He was scarred not just by the claws of a grizzly in his youth, a terrifying encounter that had left deep furrows running from his temple to his jaw, but by the deeper, invisible lacerations of lifelong rejection. If you had told the townsfolk of Silver Hollow that this hulking, solitary trapper would one day be the tenderest husband in the territory, nursing a love so profound it would become a local legend whispered around campfires for generations, they would have laughed until their ribs cracked. But destiny does not ask for the permission of cynics, nor does it consult the lonely regarding their fate. Before the warmth, before the laughter of children filled the silence of the pines, there was only the biting wind and the impossible cold of the great freeze of 1892. It was a winter that sought to bury everything, erasing the boundaries between earth and sky in a swirling vortex of white blindness. Thorn had accepted his lot in life long ago. He was the beast in the mountains, the shadow that came to town only for flour, coffee, and salt, terrified that his mere presence would curdle the milk in the pails or frighten the horses. He believed himself unworthy of a soft touch or a kind word, convinced that his large, calloused hands were made only for breaking ice, chopping wood, and skinning hides. Yet looking back, it is clear that the universe had carved that hollowness into his chest, only so it could be filled by her. The storm had descended with the sudden violence of a gunshot echoing in a canyon. Thorn was miles from his cabin, his boots crunching through the rapidly deepening drifts, his breath freezing in his beard the moment it left his lips. Visibility was reduced to the length of his own arm. The wind screamed through the pass, a banshee wail that promised eternal sleep to anyone foolish enough to stop moving for even a moment. He kept his head down, trusting the instincts that had kept him alive for 30 years in the wild, when a flash of color disrupted the endless monotony of gray and white. It was wrong, impossibly vibrant, a violent crimson stain against the pristine snowbank. Thorn narrowed his eyes, shielding them against the stinging sleet with a gloved hand, and trudged toward the anomaly. It was not a wounded animal, as he had first suspected. It was a woman. She was curled into a tight ball, half buried, a fragile sculpture of ice and silk abandoned to the mercy of the elements. She wore no heavy wool, no fur, no leather, only a tattered red dress of a style Thorn had never seen. It was silk, embroidered with golden threads that now looked like frost-bitten veins, a garment meant for a palace, not a blizzard. She was motionless, her skin the color of pale marble, her black hair fanned out against the snow like spilled ink. Panic, hot and unfamiliar, surged through Thorn's chest. He dropped to his knees, his massive frame acting as a windbreak, and stripped off his heavy buffalo hide coat. But as he looked at her, he knew the coat alone wouldn't be enough to bring her back from the brink. He reached into his saddle pack and pulled out his most prized possession, a thick woolen blanket woven with intricate geometric patterns in deep blues and grays. It was the only heirloom his mother had left him before she passed, a tangible reminder of the only softness he had ever known. With trembling fingers that felt clumsy and thick, he wrapped the stranger in the blanket. He swaddled her tightly, binding her to the warmth he offered, tucking the edges in to seal out the biting wind. He didn't know then that this simple, desperate act of charity was a binding covenant, a ritual older than the mountains themselves in the eyes of the woman he held. He only knew that she was too small, too beautiful, and far too cold to be left to the wolves. Thorn lifted her, shocked by how light she felt against his chest, as if her bones were made of hollow bird wings. The journey back to the cabin was a blur of physical agony. Every step was a battle against the drifts that sought to swallow them whole, the snow reaching his thighs in places. The wind tore at his exposed face, stinging his scars, but the bundle in his arms gave him a singular, driving purpose he had not felt in years. He was no longer just surviving, he was protecting. When he finally kicked open the heavy oak door of his sanctuary, The rush of stagnant dry air felt like a blessing from the Almighty. He laid her on the hearth, ignoring the ache in his own frozen joints, and immediately set to work, building the fire up from its dying embers. The flames roared to life, casting dancing shadows against the rough-hewn log walls. Thorn worked with a frantic efficiency, heating flat river stones to place near her feet, rubbing her hands between his giant rough palms to coax the blood back into circulation. He felt like a bull in a china shop, terrified that his strength would crush her, yet knowing that force was required to fight the chill of death that had settled into her marrow. As the firelight bathed her face, he saw the delicate curve of her jaw and the high arch of her cheekbones. She was a creature of a different world, exotic and terrifyingly lovely. Why was she out there? Who had left a woman in a wedding dress to die in a blizzard? The questions swirled in his mind, but they were silenced when her eyelids fluttered. They opened slowly, revealing eyes dark as obsidian, filled with a confusion that quickly settled into a strange, resolute clarity. She looked at the heavy wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, feeling its weight and texture. Then she looked up at Thorn's scarred, anxious face, illuminated by the firelight. She did not scream. She did not recoil in horror as so many others had. Instead, she pulled the blanket tighter around herself, bowing her head slightly in a gesture that felt heavy with meaning, a silent acknowledgment that hung in the air between them. The morning sun broke through the storm clouds, illuminating the cabin with a harsh, brilliant light that exposed every speck of dust and every year of bachelor neglect. Thorn woke with a start from his chair, his neck stiff, realizing he had fallen asleep, keeping watch with his rifle across his lap. He looked to the cot, expecting to find the woman still unconscious, or perhaps dead. Instead, the bed was made. The heavy wool blanket was folded with military precision at the foot of the mattress, the edges perfectly aligned. The smell of something savory and warm drifted from the cast-iron stove, a scent unlike the burnt coffee and bacon grease that usually permeated the room. Thorn stood, his boots thumping heavily on the floorboards, and turned to see her. She had cleaned. In the few hours he had slept, the woman, Lynn, though she had yet to speak her name, had swept the floor, organized his scattered tins of supplies, and was currently stirring a pot of porridge. She looked up as he rose, her movements graceful and fluid, despite the obvious exhaustion that bruised the skin beneath her eyes. When she saw him, she stopped and performed a low, formal bow, her hands clasped together at her waist. "Husband," she said. The word was heavily accented, tentative, yet spoken with absolute, unwavering conviction. Thorn froze. He blinked, certain he was still dreaming, or that the cold had touched his mind. "Miss?" he rumbled, his voice gravelly from disuse. She pointed to the blanket folded at the foot of the bed, then to herself, and then to him. "You give," she said, struggling with the words, but not the intent. "I take, husband." Thorn shook his head, a nervous, confused chuckle escaping his throat. No. You were freezing, miss. I was just warming you up. I didn't mean anything by it." But she did not smile. She moved toward him, not with the timidity of a refugee, but with the quiet authority of the lady of the house. She took a bowl of the porridge she had made and placed it in his hands. It was a domestic intimacy that Thorn had never experienced, a collision of worlds that left him reeling. He was a monster who lived in a cave. She was a delicate flower of the East. The idea that she considered herself bound to him was absurd, a misunderstanding born of trauma and language barriers. Yet, as he held the warm bowl, looking into her expectant eyes, he couldn't bring himself to shatter the illusion just yet. The warmth from the bowl seeped into his hands, matching the strange warmth spreading in his chest. The days that followed were a study in awkward, silent friction. The blizzard had passed, leaving the world buried in 5 feet of snow, trapping them together in the small cabin. Thorn expected her to be useless, a pampered ornament who would weep for her lost life or demand luxuries he couldn't provide. He was wrong. Lynn was steel wrapped in silk. She worked with a quiet, relentless energy that matched his own. She mended his torn shirts with threads pulled from the lining of her own ruined dress. She found dried herbs in his pantry he didn't even know he had, yarrow, sage, dried berries, and brewed teas that eased the constant ache in his old injuries. But the tension remained. Thorne slept on the floor near the door, rolled in a spare buffalo hide like a guard dog, refusing to take the bed while she was there. He felt the weight of his own unworthiness pressing down on him. He was too big, too scarred, too rough. Every time he caught his reflection in the window pane, he saw a beast standing next to a princess. He tried to explain, using simple words and gestures, that she was free to go as soon as the pass cleared. "I take you to town," he promised, pointing down the mountain toward the valley. "Find your family. Find help." Lynn would simply tighten her lips and look away, or busy herself with scrubbing a pot that was already clean. She seemed to be waiting for him to accept a reality he couldn't comprehend. One evening, frustrated by the silence and the weight of the misunderstanding, Thorne slammed his hand on the table. "Why?" he demanded, his voice louder than he intended, echoing off the timber walls. "Why stay? Look at me." He gestured violently to his scarred face, the jagged marks that made children cry. "I ain't no husband for the likes of you." Lynn paused, the firelight catching the shimmer of her red dress. She walked over to him, her steps silent on the wood floor, and reached out. Thorne flinched, expecting a blow or a recoil, but her small, cool hand rested gently on the jagged scar running down his cheek. Her touch was lighter than a snowflake. "You give blanket," she whispered, her eyes fierce and unblinking. "You save, world cold, you warm, my husband." It was a declaration of loyalty so profound it terrified him more than the storm ever could. It wasn't about romance. It was about survival, honor, and a debt she believed she owed with her life. A week later, the snow had packed down enough for travel. Thorne, determined to rectify this misunderstanding, hitched up his horse, a sturdy roan gelding named Buster. He told himself it was for her own good. She deserved a life in the sun, not a sentence in his gloomy cabin at the edge of the world. Lynn climbed onto the horse behind the saddle without protest, though her posture was rigid, her face a mask of stoic resignation. The journey to Silver Hollow was slow, the silence between them heavy with unspoken things. When they finally rolled into the muddy main street, heads turned. The town was a place of small minds and sharp tongues, and the sight of the scarred mountain man leading a horse bearing a woman in a red silk dress was fodder for a year's worth of gossip. Thorne ignored the stares, the whispers behind hands, and the spitting of tobacco juice as he passed. He headed straight for the trading post run by Mercer, a man who had traveled the coast and knew a smattering of the tongues from across the ocean. He helped Lynn down, noticing how the townsfolk recoiled from him, but ogled her with a mixture of curiosity and hunger. Inside the post, the air smelled of stale tobacco, sawdust, and pickled eggs. Thorne explained the situation to Mercer, desperate for a translation that would absolve him of this accidental marriage. Mercer listened, eyeing Lynn, then chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "You don't understand, Thorne," Mercer said, leaning over the counter and lowering his voice. "I've heard of this. In her village, or wherever she's from, the red dress is the bridal wear. And the blanket? If a man covers a woman in red with his own cloak or blanket, and she accepts it, it's a seal. It's an exchange of protection for loyalty. It's an old custom, older than these hills. You didn't just warm her up, son. You performed the ceremony." Thorne felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him cold. "But I didn't know," he stammered. "It was a blizzard. She was dying." Mercer shrugged, spitting into a brass spittoon near his boot. "Doesn't matter to her. She was likely brought here to be sold, or married off to some debtor who died, and you stepped in. To her, you're the husband who saved her from the snow. If you cast her off now, in her eyes, you aren't freeing her, you're divorcing her, you're shaming her before the world, you're telling everyone she wasn't worth the blanket." Thorne turned to look at Lynn. She stood by the door, her chin held high despite the whispers of the men outside. She looked small, vulnerable, and terrifyingly dignified. She was waiting for his verdict. She knew exactly what was happening, and she was prepared to accept her fate, whatever he decided. Thorne walked out of the trading post, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The town square felt like an arena. He saw the way the local miners looked at Lynn, predatory, assessing. If he left her here, if he handed her over to the care of the town, what would become of her? She was a widow of a marriage that never happened, a stranger in a land that devoured the weak. He looked at his own hands, scarred and large. They had only ever destroyed or trapped things. Could they hold something gently? He looked at Lynn. She didn't plead. She didn't cry. She simply watched him, her hands folded over the red silk of her dress, the wool blanket he had given her draped over her arm like a shield. She had honored the accidental pact. She had cleaned his home, tended his wounds, and called him husband when the rest of the world called him a beast. A strange, fierce protectiveness surged in his chest, hot and overwhelming. He walked over to the horse, adjusted the saddle, and then turned to her. He didn't smile. He didn't know how to, not really, but he softened the hard line of his jaw. He extended his hand, palm up, a silent offer, a choice. Lynn looked at his hand, then up at his eyes. The tension in her shoulders broke, just a fraction. She placed her hand in his. It was a small, fragile weight, but it anchored him to the earth in a way nothing else ever had. "Let's go home," Thorne said, his voice rough with emotion. He helped her back onto the horse. As they turned back toward the mountains, leaving the whispers of the town behind, Thorne realized with a jolt of terror and wonder that he was no longer just a trapper. He was a husband, and for the first time in his life, the path ahead didn't look quite so lonely. The spring thaw arrived not with a gentle whisper, but with the violent cracking of the river ice, a sound like cannon fire echoing through the valley. It mirrored the breaking of the long silence within the cabin, where the air had shifted from the stale tension of survival to the warm, rhythmic hum of domesticity. As the snow receded, revealing the brown, bruised earth beneath, Lynn began to claim the space around the cabin, just as she had claimed the interior. She found a patch of sunlight on the southern side of the log structure and, using an old rusted spade she had unearthed from the shed, began to turn the soil. Thorne watched her from the porch, his pipe unlit in his hand, mesmerized by her determination. She was still wearing the red dress, though she had modified it now, hemming it shorter for work, and wearing his oversized wool socks to protect her feet from the mud. She looked ridiculous and majestic all at once. He wanted to tell her that the ground was too rocky, that nothing grew this high up except stubborn pine and bitter weeds, but he couldn't bring himself to crush the hope that radiated from her. Instead, he spent his evenings quietly repairing the fence around her garden plot, driving new posts into the thawing earth with a sledgehammer, his muscles straining, offering his sweat as a silent tribute to her effort. It was during these long, golden evenings that the true nature of their arrangement began to settle into his bones. She was not leaving. The pass had been clear for weeks, yet she had not asked for the horse. She had not packed her meager belongings. She was planting seeds. One afternoon, a catalyst for their deepening union arrived in the form of a small, terrified figure. It was a child, a girl of perhaps 6 or 7, belonging to the nearest homestead 5 miles down the ridge. She had wandered too far looking for berry bushes and had stumbled into Thorne's clearing, freezing in terror when she saw the hulking shape of the trapper sharpening his skinning knife on the porch. Thorne stiffened, his old instinct to hide kicking in. He knew what he looked like to children, a bear in human clothing, a monster from a bedtime story. He lowered the knife slowly, prepared for the inevitable scream and flight. But before the girl could bolt, the cabin door creaked open. Lynn stepped out, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. She took in the scene instantly, the paralyzed child, the ashamed giant. She didn't speak a word of English to the girl. Instead, she knelt in the mud, bringing herself down to the child's eye level. She smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that Thorne rarely saw directed at him, and pulled a small, sweet, heavy cake from her pocket. She held it out, not to the girl, but to Thorne. She gestured for him to give it. It was a test and a bridge. Thorne hesitated, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stood slowly, his massive shadow falling over the girl, and extended the treat with a hand that trembled slightly. The girl looked at Lynn, who nodded encouragingly, and then at the scarred man. She took the cake. The contact was brief, her small fingers brushing his calloused palm, but it felt like a lightning strike. The girl didn't run. She ate the cake, sitting on the porch steps while Lynn hummed a tune from a land far away. For the first time, Thorne wasn't the beast in the woods. He was just a man with a porch and a wife who made sweet cakes. Summer descended on the mountain with a fierce, dry heat that smelled of pine resin and dusty sage. The cabin, once a dark cave of solitude, was now filled with light and the scent of the wild onions and herbs Lynn hung from the rafters to dry. The intimacy between them had shifted from the practical to the palpable, a slow-burning fire that left Thorne breathless in his own home. He found himself watching her constantly, the way a stray lock of black hair fell over her eyes when she scrubbed the linens, the way her neck curved when she drank water from the tin ladle. He felt a hunger that had nothing to do with food, a longing that terrified him with its intensity. He was a man who had accepted a life without touch, and now the possibility of it hung in the air, thick and heavy as the humidity before a storm. One sultry evening, after a long day of checking traps, Thorne sat by the creek to wash the grime from his arms. The water was icy, a relief against the heat. He didn't hear her approach until her reflection joined his in the stillness of the pool. Lynn stood behind him, holding a coarse towel. She didn't hand it to him. She stepped closer, her presence a tangible warmth against his back, and began to dry his shoulders herself. Thorne froze, water dripping from his beard, every nerve ending in his body setting itself on fire. Her hands were firm but gentle, tracing the landscape of his scars with a reverence that made his chest ache. She moved the towel over the jagged marks on his back, reminders of a grisly encounter a decade ago, and paused. Thorne flinched, shame curling in his gut. "Ugly," he rasped, the word tearing out of him involuntarily. Too much. Marked. He tried to pull away, to spare her the texture of his ruined skin, but Lynn moved around him, blocking his retreat. She dropped the towel and placed her bare hands on his chest, right over his heart, forcing him to look at her. The sun was setting, casting a golden halo around her silhouette, turning her dark eyes into pools of liquid amber. "Not ugly," she said, her English improving with every week of practice. "Map." She traced a line from his shoulder to his heart. "Map of strong, map of survive." She took his large, rough hand and pressed it to her own cheek, closing her eyes and leaning into his palm. It was a gesture of such supreme trust, such absolute surrender, that Thorne felt his defenses crumble into dust. He wasn't holding a porcelain doll. He was holding a woman who saw him clearly and did not look away. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, marveling at the softness, and for the first time he allowed himself to believe that the mirror she held up to him wasn't lying. The peace of their mountain sanctuary was shattered 2 weeks later, not by the elements, but by the past coming to collect. Thorne had ridden into town for supplies, leaving Lynn tending her garden when he heard the rumors swirling in the general store. A man had come from the city, a wealthy merchant with an entourage of hired hands looking for stolen property. Thorne's blood ran cold. He raced back up the mountain, pushing his horse to the point of exhaustion, dread pooling in his stomach like lead. When he broke through the tree line, his worst fears were realized. 3 horses were tethered to his fence. The front door of the cabin was wide open. Thorne leaped from the saddle before the animal had fully stopped, snatching his Winchester rifle from its scabbard. He stormed into the cabin, a roar building in his throat, only to find the scene frozen in a tableau of tension. Lynn was standing by the hearth, gripping a heavy iron poker, her face pale but fierce. Opposite her stood a man in a pristine gray suit, holding a handkerchief to his nose as if the very air of the cabin offended him. 2 armed thugs stood by the door, smirking. The man turned as Thorne entered, his eyes flicking over the trapper with disdain. "Ah," the stranger drawled, his voice oily and smooth. "The beast returns to his den, and here I was, trying to explain to your housekeeper that she has obligations elsewhere." Thorne leveled the rifle at the man's chest, the barrel steady as a rock. "Get out," he growled, the sound low and vibrating with menace. The man, who introduced himself as Mr. Harrington, chuckled without humor. He reached into his coat and produced a piece of paper. "I hold the contract on her passage, Mr. Trapper. She was imported, paid for. She is to work off her debt in the gilded houses of San Francisco, not play house in a shack with a savage." He took a step toward Lynn. "She is property, and you're a thief." The word hung in the air, ugly and violent. Thorne looked at Lynn. She wasn't looking at Harrington. She was looking at him, her eyes wide with fear, not for herself, but for what Thorne might do. She shook her head slightly, a silent plea. Thorne understood. If he shot this man, the law would come. They would hang him, and she would be taken anyway. Violence was the tool of the beast, but today he needed the strength of a husband. He slowly lowered the rifle, leaning it against the wall. Harrington smiled triumphantly. "Wise choice. Now, girl, come along." But Thorne stepped between them, his massive frame creating a wall of muscle and resolve. "No," Thorne said. His voice was not a growl now. It was the calm, immovable tone of the mountain itself. "I will buy the debt," Thorne stated, the words heavy and final. Harrington raised an eyebrow, looking around the modest cabin with a sneer. "You? With what? Pelts and pine cones?" Thorne moved to the loose floorboard beneath his cot, the hiding place of a lifetime of solitude. He pried it up and pulled out a heavy leather sack. Inside was gold dust, coins, and bills, every cent he had saved from 30 years of trapping, money he had hoarded because he had no one to spend it on, no future to invest in. It was a fortune amassed in silence and isolation. He threw the sack onto the table. It landed with a heavy, solid thud that silenced the room. "Take it," Thorne said. "Take it all. The furs in the shed, too. Take the horse. But she stays." Harrington's eyes widened as he opened the sack. It was more than the debt. It was enough to buy a small town. Greed warred with pride on his face, but greed won. He snatched the bag, signaling his men. "A fool and his money," Harrington scoffed, backing toward the door. "She isn't worth half that." He tipped his hat mockingly to Lynn. "You're lucky, darling. He bought you, though I can't imagine why." As the men rode away, their laughter fading down the canyon, silence rushed back into the room, louder and more painful than before. Thorne stood by the table, his hands empty, his life savings gone. He felt a sudden, crushing wave of insecurity. He had bought her, just as Harrington said. He had made it a transaction. Thorne turned away, unable to face her, staring out the window at the dust the riders had kicked up. "You're free," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I paid the paper. You don't owe anyone anything now. Not him. Not me." He gripped the windowsill until his knuckles turned white. "You can go to the city now. Find a life. A real husband. Someone who doesn't look like this." He waited for the sound of her footsteps moving toward the door. He waited for the inevitable relief that she would finally escape his wretched existence. Instead, he felt a sudden, sharp impact against his back. Lynn had crossed the room and slammed into him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind, pressing her face against his spine. She was shaking, he realized. Crying? No, she was angry. She squeezed him so tight it hurt. "Stupid man," she sobbed into his shirt, her voice muffled but fierce. "Stupid, big, blind husband." Thorne stood frozen, his heart stopping. She spun him around, her hands grabbing the lapels of his rough coat, shaking him, tears streaming down her face. "You pay gold for me to leave?" she demanded, her eyes blazing. "You think I stay for debt? You think I stay for blanket?" She slapped his chest with her open palm. "I stay for you. Only you." The realization hit Thorne like a physical blow, staggering him. She wasn't bound by the blanket anymore. She wasn't bound by the snow, or the debt, or the lack of options. She was choosing him. The beast, the recluse, the scarred tragedy of Silver Hollow. He looked down at her, seeing the fierce love burning through her tears, and finally, the wall around his heart collapsed. He reached out, cupping her face in his giant hands, treating her like the most precious thing in the world. "Lynn," he breathed, speaking her name like a prayer. He leaned down, and when he kissed her, it wasn't tentative. It was the desperate, starving claim of a man who had been drowning and had finally found air. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and hope and the end of winter. The wind howled outside, a summer storm rolling in, but inside there was only the fire of a promise kept. Years later, they would say that the winter of '92 was the coldest on record, but for the family in the cabin at the timberline, it was the beginning of the eternal spring. The cabin had grown over the years, a new room added here, a larger porch there, filled with the noise of 3 children who had their mother's dark eyes and their father's stubborn resilience. Thorne still trapped, but he no longer hid. He walked into town with his head high, his wife on his arm, daring anyone to look at them with anything but respect. And they did respect them, for love of that magnitude demands it. On cold nights, when the wind whistled through the eaves, Thorne would sit in his rocking chair by the fire, watching Lynn mend the clothes of their youngest. He would look at the old tattered red cheongsam hanging in the corner like a tapestry, and the heavy wool blanket folded neatly on the chest at the foot of their bed. He would remember the storm, the silence, and the moment he thought he was saving a stranger, only to realize she was saving him. He would catch her eye across the room, and she would smile, that knowing, intimate smile that said she remembered too. He was no longer the man in the ice. He was Thorne, the husband, the father, the man who had traded a blanket for a soul, and found that he had gotten the better end of the bargain.